next up going to be introducing Eleanor Perfetto, who probably needs no introduction to many of us. But I was asked first to also give some context for how we became involved in this project, which I think is a perfect introduction to Eleanor. So just for context for how the Every Life Foundation became involved, we had been engaged as the Every Life Foundation, but actually prior to the Every Life Foundation, I had been engaged in my former role in many of the patient-focused drug development workshops at the FDA. And one of our observations as a community, and many communities were observing, that there were really important elements of those PFDD workshops that were being captured in the narratives through the Voice of the Patient reports that were going beyond outcomes that patient communities were expressing. That while those outcomes were being captured within those narratives, there were also really important measurable elements of patient experience that were not what we traditionally consider to be clinical outcomes. And we were curious about how we were going to operationalize them, how we were going to ensure that that data would be captured and also utilized within our ecosystems. And beyond that, how even those outcomes that were being captured within the PFDD reports would be utilized. And so patient communities were beginning to ask that. We as a broader community were beginning to ask that. So it was a conversation that I began having with Jennifer Brait at IVI. We actually inquired with FDA as to whether or not they had any plans to take those narratives and break them down and look at the data that was coming from them in any analytical way. And we then took that conversation to the National Health Council and had a conversation with Eleanor. And as no surprise, they were also beginning to do some of that work. And that really grew into what were the early seedlings for this effort. And so we were really pleased to provide some foundational funding to what the National Health Council had already been envisioning as a project, and IVI, National Health Council, and others then continued to build on. So that is how we became involved in this. And I must say that this grew far beyond our early imaginings, and we're just really pleased to continue to be a part of it. So with that, I can think of no better way to introduce Dr. Eleanor Perfetto, who many times has done similar things with other efforts. We did hear Omar introduce her a little bit briefly earlier, but she is a professor at the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy in Baltimore and is a former executive vice president of strategic initiatives at the National Health Council. Her research and policy work primarily focus on patient engagement in healthcare, including comparative effectiveness and patient-centered outcomes research, medical product development, patient-reported outcome selection and development, value assessment, and healthcare quality. So I'm really delighted to now turn it over to Dr. Eleanor Perfetto, who will review the rationale and expected uses of our patient-centered core impact sets, or PC-CIS blueprint. Eleanor?
Thanks, Annie. I really appreciate that. So as Annie said, this actually began several years ago when we started having this conversation. And this is what it's grown into. So I feel like it felt slow going, but all of a sudden it's here. And so now it seemed like it happened so quickly. Next slide, please. My job here today is just to give you an introduction of what this is about for those of you who are just gaining some familiarity with this work. So I'm going to begin with some very basics. I'm going to talk a little bit about what PC-CIS is. Annie gave you a great overview of the rationale, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, and then some of the uses, just as a very quick introduction. And I encourage you to dig into this a little more deeply in the blueprint document itself once you have the opportunity. So what is a patient-centered core impact set, PC-CIS? So I'm going to jump into that and tell you what this is about. Next slide, please. When we talk about a patient-centered core impact set, what we mean is a patient-derived and patient-prioritized list of the most important impacts a disease and or its treatment have on a patient's health and daily life and that of their family and caregivers. So a couple of things that stand out here are that we're talking about impacts. And as Annie said, these are things that get beyond what are the typical clinical outcomes that we normally think of when we have this kind of a conversation. But these are any of the things that patients tell us are important about the way this disease or treatment is impacting their life and their family and their caregivers. So it can be health outcomes, it can be clinical types of endpoints that you might think about in studies, but it really is all of those things. It's an umbrella for all of those things. And we're talking about the core. We're talking about what patients have told us is most important. So the entirety of the list could be very lengthy. It could be 50 different impacts, but then they might tell us that there are 5 or 10 that are the most important. So we want to get to that core and find out what's happening with patients and families and what's most important about what's happening. Next slide, please. So why are they important? Why is PC-CIS important? It's important for 2 reasons, and it's distinguished by a couple of characteristics. One is that patients are engaged at the beginning, at the very, very beginning, and then throughout. So we don't invite patients in at a later point, we start with patients. It captures the full range of the disease and treatment impacts, not just what's traditional, and we consider it a precursor to all the downstream things that someone might want to do with that impact information. And as you see in this diagram, and as I'll show you in a larger version, those uses can be quite diverse. It can be anything from refining a clinical trial protocol to conducting a value assessment or a health technology assessment. Next slide, please. This figure really depicts the entire pathway for PC-CIS creation. It's the blueprint process in a snapshot. And I'm going to walk through it very quickly. On the upper left-hand corner, you see the pool of potentially important impacts. So this is the wide range of things that patients might tell us. It could include just about anything. And you see that we have some little circles there that represent some buckets of what patients might talk about. They might talk about mortality. They might talk about function. They could talk about their treatment experience or the impact on others, like their family members. So in this process, we kind of stop to step over to the right where you see patient, family, caregiver engagement to get what are the most important impacts. Of that vast pool of things, what are they telling us is important? And then getting us through a prioritization process to tell us what are the most important impacts that they have reported to us? How have they prioritized the wider list of impacts to get to what's important to them? And that's represented by those light and blue circles that are in the center, where they begin to tell us what's most important. And that number could be very small, it could be very large. It really depends on what the patients tell us. You see at the top part, stakeholder engagement and environmental scan. What this is indicating is that those are important inputs. They are very important components, but they're not all that we start with. They are not what we begin with. We begin with what patients tell us. And then we go to those things and we see what we learn from them. We have to keep in mind that sometimes the things that you find in an environmental scan may have come from older information and it may not have included patients. And so it may not reflect the patient's view at all. It may not reflect what's important to patients. It could actually be incorrect in that it's indicating what's actually the opposite of what could be important to patients. And so those feed into the process, into that pool of impacts. And then we put all of that information together in that next prioritization process that you see as that funnel that's over to the right-hand side. So we funnel that all through to get to what is most important, what's core, what's the core impact set. And then you see the arrow that funnels over to the right for what are all of those uses. What are the things that are that the core impact set could be used to inform. Next slide, please. This is a table of contents for the blueprint document itself. So the blueprint is a guide and it's a collection of resources to be used to actually create a patient-centered core outcome set. And we in this document talk about how we anticipate that it will be the patient community that will be driving this. We actually encourage the patient community to be the drivers of creating the PC-CIS, and this is a blueprint for them to do that. These are the different sections of the blueprint. If you go to the document online, you will see all these sections there, and you can dive into each one of them to see what's in there, what resources are available to help someone execute on each of these different sections. The next slide, please. So I want to give you an example of one of the tools that we've created to help someone get through this process. And you see here, we are talking about the planning stage of the core impact set. So this would be that very first part of the table of contents that you saw. And we're talking about planning, and you see establishing patient leadership. We really want for this to be led by the patient community. So there are some activities that can be done there that will help someone walk through how they would do that. And we've listed those as the phase of the activity. And then this would be this would of course be blank when a group begins to work on the blueprint and begins to create the core impact set. But there are notes there where a group can put in what they've been doing to execute on that phase of the work and how they have accomplished it. A check mark indicates that they have accomplished that, and the notes indicate how they've accomplished it. So these are the kinds of tools that are interspersed throughout the blueprint, and we're eager to hear input on these tools and whether or not others are needed or whether or not some adjustments need to be made to these. So you'll see these scattered throughout as part of the toolbox. The next slide, please. This is a list of the resources, as I was saying. So when you go to that website, you're going to see the blueprint itself, and you're going to see a list of resources. One of the things that you're going to see is the Arthritis Foundation use case. And Sue Schrand, who follows me in the next presentation, is actually going to walk through that use case and tell you more about it, because we wanted to include an example in here that someone could follow to get an idea of what the workflow might look like, what outputs might look like. And this is a case that already exists. We have some information that could help someone with budgeting if they want to apply for funding to be able to do a core impact set. So we've got some information in there that could be used as a format for a budget. We have some information that could help throughout the various pieces. I won't go through all of these, but you can take a look at them. And we really would like to see and hear from you and with your comments about each of these different pieces.